I'm Jonathan Ochshorn. I gave a talk to architecture students at Cornell University on March 13th and 15th, 2023, on the subject of health, safety, and welfare in buildings, and in particular, how those aspects of functionality or utility can be constrained by politics and economics and damaged by expression. The lecture turned out to be a bit long, so I've divided it into 6 parts, corresponding to the 6 parts of the lecture. You can find links to the 6 videos in the YouTube description section below. A lot of what I'm going to say is based on this book I recently published that deals with issues of function and safety and health and accessibility and sustainability and structures and fire safety, but from the same perspective that I just mentioned, that of politics and expression. So in this lecture, if we have time, I'm going to go through these 6 points. First, the first 2 sessions dealing with a kind of introduction to health, safety, and welfare in general. So that's a kind of a political introduction. And then also an introduction to the question of expression, aesthetics, and how that possibly could have an impact on things like life safety, fire safety, accessibility, and so forth. After that, then we'll talk about 4 elements of health, safety, and welfare, starting with fire safety, structure, accessibility, and then a little bit of sustainability if we have time. Let's see how it goes. This part 1 lecture deals with the politics of health, safety, and welfare. It starts with 2 clips from Monty Python's Architect sketch. Unfortunately, I can't show you those clips because of copyright restrictions. So bear with me while we go through the audio-only portion, and I promise that my slides will return momentarily. It's a sketch by Monty Python. It's called Architect Sketch. You definitely should find it on YouTube if you haven't seen it already. And in it, this is the client who's going to interview a couple of architects. Here's the first one now, to talk about their building proposals. And the first one says this is a 12-story block, Neo-Georgian features, all the advantages of modern design. I don't have a British accent, which is a problem. They go along, the tenants go along the conveyor belt and they pass these rotating knives. And the last 20 feet are heavily soundproofed. The blood pours down these chutes and so forth and so on. And then at that point, the developers of the project interrupted and you say, you know, what did you say? Did you say something about blood, rotating knives? So the point here is that this was meant as a parody. Like, why in the world would architects put rotating knives in their buildings? So this is well, you know what this is. It's a photograph of the Fine Arts Library, and B is the way it was built. The little circle labeled A is the way it was first proposed. Now, they're not rotating knives, but they do have a kind of a knife-like shape and potentially a knife-like impact. They're right at the level where you would, if you're somehow distracted, let's say you're looking at your cell phone, or if you have a visual impairment, you could just easily, and I love Photoshop, run into one of these things, and it would be a problem. So, you know, back in the day, I pointed this out to this was before the building was renovated, and they added these so-called cane detection bars, and they dulled the edge of the knives. But the point is, you know, why would an architect go down that path in the first place? So this is the same architect sketch, Monty Python. He continues with the second architect, Mr. Levy of whatever. And the second architect has a different scheme. And this scheme has various problems that emerge as he describes the project. He says, frankly, I think that the central pillar system would need strengthening. Isn't that going to put the cost up? Well, it might. I don't know whether I'd worry about strengthening that much. After all, they're not meant to be luxury flats. I quite agree. Providing tenants are light build and relatively sedentary, given a spot of good weather, I think we're onto a winner here. So this is the kind of cynicism of the clients saying, we're not going to spend more money to try to strengthen this building. We'll just make sure that the people living in the building have a weight limit so that they don't stress the structure inordinately. This is a recent half-year-old news article from BBC News. And so again, is life imitating art or art imitating life? But if you read the fine print, or not even the fine print, how about the bold print? The exact same thing is being proposed. They've discovered that some of the hospitals in Britain have some structural weaknesses. And so rather than fixing them, the proposal is to restrict the use of the operating theaters to patients under 120 kilograms. In other words, to limit the weight of the patients, exactly as in the Monty Python sketch. So what is created as parody, as satire, ends up uncovering a kind of a truth about architectural design, which is that there are certain issues about functionality. Some of them are driven by politics. Some of them are driven by this dysfunctional competition for modes of expression that run against the notion of health, safety, and welfare. So it's not like I can use Monty Python to prove my case, but I thought I would introduce the subject with them and then go on to something even stranger and also British. This is Thomas Hobbes. Maybe you've come across him in high school or college. And basically, he is, writing back in the middle of the 17th century. So it's a long time ago. And he's developing a kind of an ideology for this emerging thing called capitalism, trying to justify it because it's really a nasty thing. So how do you explain this nasty thing to society at large? And that was his task. I'm not sure if he understood it as such, but in looking back in hindsight, that's what his task was, is to develop an ideology for capitalism, and it's still with us to this day. And two of the important elements of this ideology have to do with property and freedom. Private property was sacrosanct. You should be able to accumulate as much as you possibly can. And then the second thing was, since he understood that if he just gave everybody instructions to accumulate as much property as possible, there would inevitably be some conflicts. Two people might have their sights on the same piece of property, for example. So he had to make sure that this was based on a kind of a contractual arrangement, and he needed somebody to enforce this arrangement. And so this is what he called the Leviathan, a sovereign, a monarch in his day, what we would just call the government or the state, something to enforce the rules of freedom and property. I think it's important to understand that as an ideology and as one that is with us to this very day, in order to understand the motivations for some of the political elements that influence health, safety, and welfare. Now, in the modern context, yes, we don't have too many monarchs left. We have governments, of course. And through this governmental agency, we end up with these documents that are become part of the legal infrastructure of our society, in particular, building codes and zoning ordinances, which are the two elements of the law regulating property that are most relevant to questions of health, safety, and welfare in buildings. How did these things come about? What goes into these things, and who makes those determinations, and how did they decide? Well, the premise that I'm taking here is that it doesn't happen because of some sort of voluntary action based on morality or ethics, but instead, as you can read in the second bullet point, building codes and zoning ordinances are designed to enforce a kind of governmental intervention. This is the Leviathan, right? Which constrains the right of property owners. By that, I mean literally, it says, yes, you own this property, but you can't do whatever you want. So this is one of the major contradictions in the theory of Hobbes, and one he felt very comfortable with, that yes, you have absolute freedom, but on the other hand, you have this state which can limit your freedom. This is a contradiction. You cannot reconcile those two things. when you constrain the rights of property owners, you say, you cannot do this with your property. You cannot build a 12-story building here. It appears to the property owners as an imposition on them. So they look at their own self-interest, and they're always complaining about government. And you can see this in the political debates that are constantly raging in our country and in all modern capitalist democracies. But the state's interest isn't just to somehow punish property owners. The state's interest is to make the system work. The state understands this contradiction, understands that leaving property owners unfettered destroys the system, that you have to have some rules that guide their action, otherwise they will self-destruct. And if you're reading the news now or yesterday or a week ago or a month ago or a month from now, every day you will find that happening. I mean, this is a constant subtext in all news stories that are headlining in the New York Times, in the Guardian, whatever you're reading, Fox News. It's always the same thing. Why should we regulate banks? Why shouldn't we have freedom to do what we want as owners of this property? And then on the one hand, the government says, no, we need to regulate the banks. On the other hand, there's a kind of a competition, not only within this country, but internationally, which says, no, we need to let our capitalists compete against other international capitalists. And if we put too many regulations on them, they won't be able to adequately compete. None of this makes sense. I'm just explaining it as a contradiction. It simply remains a contradiction. It was when Thomas Hobbes formulated it in 1651. It is now. Nevertheless, to understand what goes on in building codes and zoning ordinances, I think that context is important. So health, safety, and welfare are not protected absolutely, but only to the extent necessary to facilitate the accumulation of wealth in the form of private property, to protect the system of private property, including both human and natural resources, from collapse. So you can't just let people do what they want. That will cause a kind of system self-destruction. On the other hand, you can't overly regulate them if you want to compete within a world capitalist order. So it's a constant issue, and it in the end determines, in a kind of balancing act, what goes into the building codes, what stays out, what the limits are on safety, on health, and on welfare. So the resolution of the conflict that results in both upper and lower bounds for the functionality of buildings. If you just take safety, for example, you can't make buildings too safe. That would make them too expensive. If New York State changed their building laws to make buildings safer, then many businesses would move out of New York State into Connecticut or New Jersey, where the laws were not quite so stringent, because then they could build at a cheaper cost, and lowering costs of production is a mode of competition for all capitalist businesses. If you don't, then you get swallowed up by somebody who has cheaper production costs. So it's not like they have a choice. Once you buy into the system, you are forced, because of this competition at all levels of government, even within the private sector, you're forced to balance too much safety with too little safety. And of course, the government steps in and says, no, you can't have too little safety. Otherwise, the next time a hurricane strikes or an earthquake strikes, we'll get too much damage. And not only are the working class and the poor people at risk, but also you are in your big, tall office building or super slim apartment house. So there's a kind of a minimum level of safety that's required just to keep the thing and keep the system in operation, and then an upper level of safety to keep things from being too expensive. And that's a balance. And the balance isn't necessarily good for people or for natural resources. You may be curious as to how this manifests itself in the land of the free and the home of the brave. Well, it shows up in the American Constitution, first in a kind of poetic way, and then in a more explicit way, but never that explicit. I mean, there's a preamble to the Constitution which talks about securing the blessings of liberty. That's a code word or phrase that simply means freedom. Liberty is freedom. It means the freedom to use and accumulate property. So even though they don't use the word property in the preamble, that's what they're thinking. In fact, they didn't even have to say it, because all of the founding fathers, so-called, that was second nature to their way of thinking. In fact, their favorite authors were people like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. But then a few years after the Constitution was ratified,
about 80 years later,
you get the 14th Amendment, which is more explicit. It says that no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges, blah, 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 nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property. So we're most concerned with property. It means this is embedding this notion of private property into the Constitution. That's where it shows up. And the state can't take it away, or can they? Well, there's a kind of a fine print there, not so fine, without due process of law. That means they can, as long as they do it lawfully. So again, it's the exact same contradiction that Thomas Hobbes articulated. Yes, you have this absolute right to property, except when you don't. If that wasn't enough, then every president since Ronald Reagan, for you guys, that's like a long time ago. For me, it's just like an unpleasant memory. He makes an executive action, Executive Order 12291. And what it says is that any federal agency making a regulatory action, it shall not be undertaken unless the potential benefits to society outweigh the potential costs to society. So it's just putting into law the fact that if you're going to do something, let's say you want to regulate global warming gases, well, you have to prove that you're going to save more money than you will spend enforcing the law. So you can't do it just because you feel like, well, this is good for the planet, or humanity is in an existential crisis, and if we don't do it, there's going to be some catastrophic collapse of the planet as we know it. That's not good enough. You have to do it in monetary terms and say, here's the costs, here's the benefits, and they have to be reconciled or it won't pass muster. And it's not just Reagan. Similar executive orders, they were revised, they're tweaked a little bit, but they're all the same, essentially, in the Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, and now the Biden administrations all have the same kind of executive order because they all have the same ideology, albeit slightly different takes on it. And this order is entirely ambiguous. I mean, there are cases that come up where, let's say, Trump, during his administration, just voided a regulation because he says, no, the calculations don't add up. This is costing too much money. Whereas the Biden administration or Obama before him might have looked at exactly the same thing, but calculated the costs and benefits differently. Like, how do you calculate the benefit of being able to swim in a lake because it's cleaned up? How do you put a monetary value on that? Well, that's why you have academics researching these things, and they all come up with different numbers because they have different kind of underlying ideologies. So it's, even though you have these executive orders, they obviously can be used depending on who is doing the interpretation in many different ways. And again, this shows up in the daily news a lot. I don't mean the daily news, the newspaper, I mean every day in the news. And specifically with calculations of can the EPA regulate smokestack emissions? Obama says yes, Trump says no, because they're using different measures of cost. It's not at all clear cut, but the principle is clear cut. More on this tension between freedom of property and the government's right to intervene to constrain that freedom. A very famous and important Supreme Court ruling back in 1926, the city of Euclid, which is outside of Cleveland or in Ohio somewhere, versus Ambler, which was the real estate company that wanted to do something that the zoning law prohibited. And they said, you can't take away our freedom to use our property any way we want. It went all the way up this ladder of courts, and finally it ended up at the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court back in 1926 ruled that the zoning was permissible And this was a landmark ruling because up until then, the question of whether the government could intervene to regulate the uses of property was up in the air. You on the one hand, you had the freedom of property to do whatever you want. On the other hand, you had this idea that, well, there's the public good. We can enforce that in some way. So what was interesting about the ruling, though, is that even when they made the ruling in favor of the city of Euclid, they had some fine print in their ruling. And what they said was that the line which in this field separates the legitimate from the illegitimate assumption of power, that is state power, is not capable of precise delimitation. It varies with circumstances and conditions. A regulatory zoning ordinance, which would be clearly valid as applied to the great cities, might be clearly invalid as applied to rural communities. So they're giving themselves like a way out. And, as Supreme Courts change from liberal to conservative, you never know what the court will rule when the next zoning case comes there. They may rule that, no, this builder or developer doesn't have to build, let's say, subsidized housing. That's an infringement on his freedom. You just don't know how they're going to come down because you're dealing with this contradiction, and the Constitution itself and the rulings in these cases are sufficiently ambiguous that it's just impossible to predict what the trajectory of these rulings will be. So my argument is that governmental intervention in the area of health, safety, and welfare is not based on free-floating moral concerns, but rather on calculations that value the interests of property owners and the competitive needs of capital. We'll see in the following discussion that functional or utilitarian requirements mandated in buildings, now this is whether they're for fire safety, structure, accessibility, light, ventilation, sustainability, all must be consistent with this fundamental state interest. Now, health, safety, and welfare are not only constrained by economics and political action, they can also be damaged by dysfunctional modes of expression. And that's what we'll talk about in the next section.